Sometimes the universe has a twisted sense of humor, and sometimes it just enjoys watching bureaucrats make catastrophically stupid decisions. Today was definitely one of those days when both cosmic forces decided to team up and create the most magnificent administrative disaster I'd ever witnessed. Watching 3 Thrakari cubs sob uncontrollably while clinging to a human female was about to become the textbook example of why our species should never be allowed to make important decisions without adult supervision. My name is Commander Zoran Blackstorm, and I've seen enough governmental incompetence to fill 17 databases. But what happened in Conference Room Gamma 7 on the morning of Stellar Day 347 made every previous administrative blunder look like minor clerical errors. The human's name was Mira Goldstream, another one of those ridiculously optimistic names that humans seem to specialize in, like they were trying to manifest cosmic prosperity through sheer linguistic audacity. She stood barely 5 feet tall, had auburn hair that defied at least 3 laws of physics, and possessed the kind of stubborn determination that made seasoned bureaucrats reach for emergency sedatives. The cubs were called Talon, Fang, and Claw, because apparently, Thrakari naming conventions prioritized intimidation over creativity. Each one stood about 4 feet high, covered in sleek silver fur with retractable razor-sharp appendages, and equipped with the kind of predatory instincts that should have made any rational being maintain a safe distance of at least 50 meters. Should have been the operative phrase here. The crisis began 6 months earlier, when the Thrakari homeworld suffered what their government politely termed an ecological adjustment period. In reality, their planet had been strip-mined by corporate interests until the ecosystem collapsed, leaving millions of Thrakari refugees scattered across the galaxy. The cubs had been orphaned during the evacuation and placed in our emergency foster care system. Standard protocol dictated immediate placement with compatible species. Thrakari cubs required specific environmental conditions, specialized nutrition, and careful socialization to prevent them from developing what our psychologists called terminal aggression syndrome. The waiting list for qualified Thrakari foster families stretched longer than a neutron star's gravitational field. That's when some genius in the placement department decided to try something innovative. They assigned the cubs to Mira Goldstream, a human xenobiologist who had volunteered for our interspecies adoption program. The reasoning, according to the case files, was that humans had demonstrated remarkable adaptability in cross-species child-rearing situations. What the case files failed to mention was that no human had ever attempted to raise Thrakari cubs before. Because Thrakari cubs were apex predators, whose idea of play involved activities that would require trauma counseling for most other species. I should have intervened immediately. The moment I saw the assignment paperwork, every instinct screamed that this was a catastrophe waiting to happen. But the bureaucratic machinery had already been set in motion, and stopping it would have required approximately 17 different authorizations codes and a formal hearing before the Subcommittee on Species-Appropriate Placement Protocols. So instead, I filed my concerns in triplicate and prepared to document what I assumed would be either a tragic accident or the fastest foster placement failure in council history. I was wrong about everything. 3 days after the placement, I received my first status report from Mira. Instead of the anticipated emergency evacuation request, she sent a cheerful message informing me that the cubs had settled in beautifully and were learning human customs with remarkable enthusiasm. Attached to the message was a video file that made me question everything I thought I knew about interspecies compatibility. The footage showed Mira's living quarters, a modest space decorated with what humans called cozy furniture and warm lighting. But what caught my attention wasn't the environment. It was the scene taking place within it. Talon, the largest cub, was carefully arranging what appeared to be human children's toys while making soft purring sounds that definitely weren't in any Thrakari behavioral database. Fang was curled up beside Mira on something called a couch, reading what looked like a human picture book. Claw, the youngest, was wearing what humans referred to as pajamas, and appeared to be having an animated conversation with Mira about the contents of his bedtime story. None of this should have been possible. Thrakari cubs didn't play with toys. They practiced hunting techniques. They didn't read books. They studied predatory behavior patterns. They certainly didn't wear clothing or engage in casual conversation with other species. Yet there they were, 3 apex predator juveniles acting like, well, like children. I immediately scheduled an inspection visit, convinced that the video had been manipulated or that Mira was somehow drugging the cubs into docility. What I found instead challenged every assumption our xenobiological departments had made about Thrakari development. The cubs weren't drugged. They weren't manipulated. They were thriving. Mira had somehow created an environment that allowed them to express aspects of their personalities that their own species had never recognized. She had given them the opportunity to be curious instead of aggressive, playful instead of predatory, affectionate instead of aloof. They're incredibly intelligent, Mira explained during my inspection, while Talon demonstrated his ability to solve complex puzzles, and Fang showed me artwork he had created using human drawing materials. They just needed someone to see past the survival instincts to the individuals underneath. Claw approached me during the visit, offering me a crude but recognizable drawing of what appeared to be their little family group. When I accepted it, he made that impossible purring sound and hugged my leg with surprising gentleness. I left that inspection completely convinced that we were witnessing something unprecedented in interspecies child development. These cubs weren't just surviving in human care. They were flourishing in ways that their own species had never achieved, which naturally is when the Galactic Welfare Council decided to destroy everything. The directive came down from the High Committee on Species Preservation, delivered with all the bureaucratic efficiency of a plasma torpedo to the cranium. Immediate removal of the Thrakari cubs from human custody. Placement in species-appropriate facilities for proper cultural development. No appeals process. No consideration of individual circumstances. No acknowledgement that these particular cubs had found something extraordinary in their human home. The justification was pure bureaucratic doublespeak. Concerns regarding cultural dilution and species identity confusion necessitate immediate corrective action to preserve traditional Thrakari developmental patterns. Translation: we can't let word get out that human parenting might be better than our established protocols. Assistant Director Vera Stormcrest, head of the Species Preservation Committee, personally delivered the removal order. She arrived at Mira's residence with a full enforcement team, legal documentation, and the kind of expression that suggested she had already decided this was going to be unpleasant for everyone involved. "Ms. Goldstream," she announced, her voice carrying the warm empathy of automated traffic control. "By order of the Galactic Welfare Council, you are hereby directed to surrender custody of the Thrakari juveniles for immediate transfer to approved species-specific facilities." Mira's reaction was immediate and intense. "You want to take them away? They're happy here. They're healthy. They're learning and growing and they're developing inappropriate behavioral patterns," Stormcrest interrupted. "Thrakari cubs require proper socialization within their own cultural framework. What you've created here is an artificial environment that will handicap them for adult integration." That's when the cubs realized what was happening. Talon stepped protectively in front of Mira, his retractable claws extending for the first time since I'd known him. But instead of the aggressive posture I expected, his stance was purely defensive. He wasn't threatening the enforcement team. He was shielding his human mother. Fang moved to Mira's side, pressing against her leg while making distressed sounds that definitely weren't in any Thrakari communication manual. His silver fur had darkened to a color I'd never seen before, something that seemed to indicate protective anxiety rather than predatory aggression. Claw, the youngest, did something that made every enforcement officer in the room step back in confusion. He wrapped his arms around Mira's waist and began crying, not the aggressive vocalizations of a frustrated predator, not the territorial disputes of an apex species defending resources. He was crying like a heartbroken child who didn't understand why strangers wanted to take him away from his mother. "They don't want to go," Mira said, her own voice thick with emotion as she gently stroked Claw's fur. "Look at them. This isn't about species development or cultural preservation. This is about 3 children who love their home and don't want to be separated from their family." Assistant Director Stormcrest's expression remained unmoved. "Emotional attachment is precisely the problem, Ms. Goldstream. These cubs are developing dependency behaviors that will compromise their ability to function as independent Thrakari adults." "Independent?" Mira's voice rose to levels that made the enforcement team fidget nervously. "They're 6 years old. They should be dependent. They should feel safe and loved and protected. They should be learning to hunt, to establish dominance hierarchies, to prepare for adult territorial conflicts, Stormcrest countered. What you've created here is a fantasy that will leave them completely unprepared for real life. That's when Talon did something that changed everything. He spoke. Not in Thrakari clicks and growls. Not in the subsonic communications his species typically used. He spoke in clear, precise galactic standard, with the kind of emotional intelligence that made the enforcement team exchange uncertain glances. "Please do not take us away from Mother Mira," he said, his young voice carrying dignity and desperation in equal measure. "We are learning important things here. We are learning to be kind. We are learning to help others. We are learning to solve problems without fighting." Fang stepped forward, adding his own voice to his brother's plea. "We do not want to be weapons. We want to be good children. Mother Mira teaches us how to be good." Claw looked up at the enforcement team with eyes that held entirely too much understanding for someone his age. "Why do you want to make us mean again? We like being happy." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear my own circulatory system humming. Assistant Director Stormcrest stared at the cubs like they had spontaneously developed the ability to manipulate quantum mechanics. Which, from her perspective, they probably had. Because nothing in Thrakari developmental psychology suggested they were capable of this level of emotional sophistication. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," she said finally, though her voice lacked its earlier conviction. "You've taught them to suppress their natural instincts in favor of alien behavioral patterns. They're not learning to be Thrakari. They're learning to be human. They're learning to be themselves," Mira corrected. "The version of themselves that they want to be, instead of the version that biology and cultural expectations decided for them." The enforcement team looked increasingly uncomfortable as the cubs continued clinging to Mira while making those heartbreaking distressed sounds. Several officers kept glancing at Assistant Director Stormcrest, clearly hoping she would reconsider the removal order. But bureaucratic momentum, once established, has its own inexorable gravity. "The order stands," Stormcrest announced. "Enforcement team, begin custody transfer procedures." And that's when these three supposedly domesticated cubs demonstrated that they hadn't forgotten how to be apex predators. They just chose not to be. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. One moment they were crying children begging not to be separated from their mother. The next, they had become a coordinated pack of juvenile predators whose only goal was protecting their human. Talon moved first, positioning himself directly between the enforcement team and Mira, with fluid grace that spoke of genetic programming older than civilization. His claws extended fully, gleaming like surgical instruments in the artificial lighting. But here's what made my scales crawl. His movements weren't chaotic or aggressive. They were calculated, precise, purposeful. Fang circled to the left flank while Claw took the right, creating a defensive triangle that would have impressed military tacticians. Their coordination was flawless, instinctive, and absolutely silent. No communication that our equipment could detect, just three minds working as one unified protective unit. The enforcement officers reached for their weapons, but Talon's voice stopped them cold. "We will not hurt you," he said, his words carrying the kind of calm authority that belonged on adult warriors, not 6-year-old children. "But we will not allow you to take our mother." Assistant Director Stormcrest's face had gone pale, and I could see her finally understanding what she had stumbled into. These weren't just adopted alien children throwing a tantrum. These were apex predators who had learned human concepts like family loyalty and were now applying those concepts with Thrakari efficiency. "Stand down immediately," she commanded, though her voice lacked conviction. "You're proving exactly why this placement was inappropriate. This behavior is protective," Mira interrupted, stepping forward despite being surrounded by creatures whose claws could shred reinforced plasteel. "They're protecting someone they love. That's not inappropriate behavior. That's exactly what any good child should do when strangers try to take them from their family." The cubs shifted slightly, still maintaining their defensive formation, but allowing Mira to move closer to the enforcement team. Their trust in her was absolute. their willingness to follow her lead complete. "You see this as a problem," Mira continued, her voice gaining strength as she addressed Stormcrest directly. "I see this as proof that they've learned the most important lesson any species can master. Love is worth fighting for." The standoff stretched on, 3 children and 1 human woman facing down the full authority of galactic bureaucracy through sheer determination and the revolutionary concept that families shouldn't be destroyed for administrative convenience. That's when Captain Steele Hawkins burst through the door like a vengeful deity wearing combat armor. The enforcement team spun toward the new threat, only to freeze when they realized who had just entered their carefully controlled situation. Hawkins commanded the Galactic Defense Force's elite rapid response unit, and his reputation for creative problem-solving was legendary throughout known space. He also happened to be Mira's older brother, a fact that had somehow escaped the notice of our thoroughly incompetent intelligence division. "Well, well," Hawkins drawled, his scarred face breaking into a grin that made hardened criminals surrender without resistance. "Looks like someone forgot to mention they were planning to terrorize my baby sister and her kids." Assistant Director Stormcrest's expression cycled through confusion, recognition, and absolute horror in the span of 3 seconds. "Captain Hawkins, this is a civilian matter. Military intervention is neither requested nor appropriate." "Civilian matter?" Hawkins chuckled, the sound carrying the same warmth as a supernova. "Lady, you just threatened to kidnap 3 children from their mother using armed force. Where I come from, that's called something entirely different." The Cubs had maintained their defensive positions, but I noticed their posture shift slightly. They recognized Hawkins as family, someone who belonged in their protective circle rather than outside it. "Uncle Steele," Claw called out, his voice bright with genuine joy despite the ongoing crisis. "Did you come to help us stay with Mother Mira?" "You bet I did, little fighter," Hawkins replied, his tone completely transforming when addressing the Cubs. "Nobody messes with my family. Nobody." Stormcrest attempted to regain control of the situation. "Captain, regardless of personal relationships, this removal has been authorized by the High Committee. These Cubs require proper species-specific development, not emotional manipulation by alien influences." Hawkins' expression went arctic. "Emotional manipulation? You mean love, care, the novel concept of treating children like they matter instead of like biological specimens? They're apex predators," Stormcrest snapped. "They need to learn survival skills, dominance hierarchies, territorial behaviors. What they're learning here will leave them vulnerable and weak in the real world." That's when Talon did something that made everyone in the room reconsider their understanding of Thrakari psychology. He laughed. Not a predatory chuckle or an aggressive bark. A genuine, delighted laugh that belonged on a playground rather than a battlefield. "Assistant Director," he said, his young voice carrying an intelligence that made veteran negotiators nervous. "With respect, I think you misunderstand what makes someone strong." Fang stepped closer to his brother, adding his own perspective. "We know how to hunt. We know how to fight. We know how to survive. Mother Mira did not take those skills away. She taught us when to use them and when to choose something better." "And what?" Stormcrest asked with barely concealed frustration. "Could possibly be better than apex predator capabilities?" Claw looked up at her with the kind of wisdom that should have been impossible at his age. "Knowing that you do not have to hurt others to be safe. Knowing that helping people is better than defeating them. Knowing that being loved is better than being feared." The enforcement team exchanged glances that clearly indicated they were having second thoughts about this entire operation. Several officers had relaxed their weapon grips, and at least 2 were looking like they wanted to be anywhere else in the galaxy. Captain Hawkins stepped closer to Stormcrest, his voice dropping to conversational levels that somehow carried more menace than shouting. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to take your paperwork, your enforcement team, and your bureaucratic nonsense, and you're going to leave. These kids stay with their mother." "That's not how the law works, Captain. The High Committee's authority supersedes personal preferences." "Actually," I interrupted, finally finding my voice after watching this catastrophe unfold, "it doesn't." Everyone turned to stare at me, which was unfortunate, Because I hate being the center of attention almost as much as I hate bureaucratic overreach. Section 847 of the Galactic Welfare Code, I continued, consulting my datapad with hands that were definitely not shaking, clearly states that removal orders can be challenged on the basis of demonstrable harm to the subjects involved. These cubs are thriving under current placement conditions. Stormcrest's face contorted into an expression that suggested she was seriously considering having me arrested. That section applies to emergency situations where immediate danger is present. Psychological trauma from forced family separation constitutes immediate danger, I replied, gaining confidence as I spoke. Furthermore, Section 923 requires consideration of subject preferences in placement decisions for individuals demonstrating sufficient cognitive development. The cubs' earlier display of intelligence and emotional sophistication had definitely qualified them for that protection. Hawkins grinned like a predator who had just spotted wounded prey. Sounds like someone didn't do their homework before trying to break up my family. This is highly irregular, Stormcrest protested, though her voice lacked its earlier authority. So is trying to destroy the most successful interspecies adoption in Council history, Mira said, finally stepping out from behind her protective cubs. These children have achieved levels of psychological development that your species-appropriate facilities have never produced. They're not just surviving, they're flourishing. Talon nodded eagerly. We want to show other Thrakari cubs that there are different ways to be strong. Ways that include kindness and cooperation and family love. We want to be ambassadors, Fang added. We want to teach both species that working together makes everyone better. Claw looked directly at Stormcrest with eyes that held no anger, only compassion. We want to help you understand that families come in many shapes. Even yours could be bigger if you let it. The room fell silent except for the hum of environmental systems. I watched Stormcrest's expression cycle through several emotions before settling on something that might have been resignation. This is unprecedented, she said finally. Good, Hawkins replied. Precedents are just excuses for doing the same stupid things repeatedly. Time for some new approaches. Stormcrest looked around the room, taking in the defensive cubs, the determined human parents, the unsympathetic enforcement team, and my increasingly detailed legal citations. I'll need to consult with the High Committee. You do that, Mira said, gathering her cubs close. We'll be right here, being a family. The enforcement team filed out with the defeated air of people who had just realized they were the villains in someone else's story. Stormcrest lingered at the doorway, her expression unreadable. This isn't over, she said, though it sounded more like a promise than a threat. Actually, I called after her, it is. I'm recommending this case as a model for future interspecies placements. The High Committee will be very interested in replicating these results. After they left, the cubs immediately relaxed their defensive postures and resumed being ordinary children. Claw climbed into Mira's lap, Fang retrieved his abandoned book, and Talon began reorganizing his toys with the methodical precision of someone processing stress through familiar activities. Thank you, Uncle Steele, Talon said as Hawkins settled into what appeared to be his regular chair. We were scared they would take us away from home. Nobody's taking you anywhere, kiddo, Hawkins assured him. Your mom and I fought bigger battles than some paper-pushing bureaucrats. 6 months later, the Brightwater Hawkins household had become a case study in successful interspecies adoption. The High Committee, faced with undeniable evidence of the cubs' remarkable development, officially adopted the Goldstream Protocols for cross-species child placement. The cubs continued thriving, eventually establishing the first Thrakari human cultural exchange program. They proved that apex predators didn't have to choose. Between strength and compassion, that survival skills and emotional intelligence could coexist beautifully. Other Thrakari refugees began requesting human foster families. Then came requests from Christek orphans, Vaporlord juveniles, and even a few young Harmony builders, whose parents had been lost in various conflicts. Mira expanded her home to accommodate the growing number of children who needed families. Hawkins retired from active military duty to help coordinate the placement program. I left my bureaucratic position to become their official advocate and legal counsel. The cubs grew into remarkable adults who split their time between Earth and Thrakari settlement worlds, teaching both species that family bonds transcended biological origins. They never forgot the day enforcement officers tried to separate them from their mother, but they used that memory to fuel their passion for protecting other children from similar trauma. As for Assistant Director Stormcrest, she eventually requested transfer to the newly created Department of Interspecies Family Services. Turned out she had simply needed someone to show her that regulations existed to serve people, not the other way around. Looking back, I realized the most important lesson from that crisis wasn't about bureaucratic procedure or legal precedent. It was about the fundamental human truth that love creates family, and family is worth defending against any force in the universe. Even bureaucracy. Especially bureaucracy. Because in the end, 3 frightened children clinging to their human mother had accomplished something that centuries of diplomatic negotiation had failed to achieve. They had proven that the strongest force in the cosmos wasn't military might or technological advancement or economic power. It was a species that consistently chose to see individuals instead of categories, children instead of specimens, potential instead of programming. Humans, it turned out, weren't just good at adopting alien children. They were excellent at teaching the rest of us how to be family. But the real test of their revolutionary approach came 3 weeks later, when the unthinkable happened. The Thrakari homeworld government formally requested the return of their cubs. Not through bureaucratic channels this time, not through the Galactic Welfare Council's convoluted legal processes. This was a direct diplomatic communication from Prime Minister Valdris Ironmane himself, delivered by armed escort and carrying the full weight of a species desperate to reclaim what they saw as their genetic future. The message was succinct and terrifying. Return our offspring immediately, or face economic and military consequences for harboring stolen Thrakari citizens. I was present when Mira received the ultimatum, sitting in her expanded living room, while watching Talon teach basic mathematics to a newly arrived Christek orphan named Sparkle. The integration of species in her household had become so natural that seeing a Thrakari cub, a silicon-based juvenile, and 2 human teenagers working on homework together felt completely normal, which made the threat of dissolution even more heartbreaking. "They can't be serious," Mira said, her voice steady despite the obvious tremor in her hands. "The cubs are citizens here now. They chose this life." Captain Hawkins studied the diplomatic document with the grim expression of someone calculating odds in an unwinnable battle. "They're claiming the cubs were too young to make informed decisions about citizenship. That human influence constituted a form of cultural brainwashing." Brainwashing? Fang looked up from where he was helping Sparkle understand geometric concepts. "Is that what they call teaching us to read and think and question things instead of just obeying orders?" Claw moved closer to Mira, that old anxiety returning to his posture. "Mother Mira, do we have to go back? Do we have to be weapons again?" Before Mira could answer, something extraordinary happened. Sparkle, the young Christek who had only been with them for 2 weeks, began glowing with protective energy. "No," the silicon-based child declared, her crystalline structure flaring with indignant light. "Talon and Fang and Claw are my brothers now. Mira is my mother too. Nobody takes family away." The loyalty cascade was immediate and overwhelming. Every foster child in the house, representing 7 different species, converged on the living room with expressions of fierce determination. They formed a protective circle around Mira and the cubs, and I realized I was witnessing something that would reshape interstellar politics forever. "We stand together," announced Buzz, a young harmony builder whose telepathic abilities had been damaged by trauma. "All families, all species, all protection." "Try to take one, you take us all," added Whisper, a void-dweller adolescent whose shadow manipulation abilities made the room's lighting flicker ominously. Prime Minister Ironmane arrived the following day with a diplomatic entourage that included military advisors, legal specialists, and enough firepower to level a small city. He was everything I expected from Thrakari leadership. 8 feet of muscle and metal, scales polished to mirror brightness, and the kind of controlled violence that made veteran diplomats retire early. What I didn't expect was his reaction when he saw the cubs. Talon approached his biological parent with careful dignity, performing a traditional Thrakari greeting before switching to Galactic Standard. "Honored Prime Minister, welcome to our home." We are pleased to show you what we have learned. Iron Mane's massive head tilted as he studied his son. You speak like a politician instead of a warrior. They have corrupted your natural instincts. They have expanded my natural instincts, Talon corrected gently. I can still hunt, still fight, still protect what matters. But now I also know when fighting is unnecessary and when cooperation achieves better results. Fang stepped forward, offering the Prime Minister a datapad. We have prepared a presentation about our education here. We thought you might want to understand what we are learning. The presentation was remarkable. Not because of its technical sophistication, but because of its emotional intelligence. The cubs had documented their development, showing comparative analyses of their capabilities before and after human integration. They had become stronger, faster, more mentally agile, and infinitely more creative. But most importantly, they had learned to think beyond traditional Thrakari limitations. We do not wish to abandon our heritage, Claw explained to his increasingly bewildered leader. We wish to expand it, to show other Thrakari cubs that strength comes in many forms. Prime Minister Ironmane listened to the entire presentation in silence, his expressions cycling through confusion, anger, and something that might have been awe. When it concluded, he turned to Mira with undisguised hostility. You have turned my people's children into philosophers instead of warriors. I've turned them into people who can choose to be warriors when necessary and philosophers when appropriate, Mira replied calmly. They haven't lost their capabilities. They've gained wisdom about when and how to use them. Show me, Ironmane demanded. What followed was the most unusual diplomatic demonstration in recorded history. The cubs, working with their adoptive siblings, created scenarios that tested every aspect of traditional Thrakari development while incorporating human innovations. They demonstrated hunting techniques that required cooperation instead of competition. They showed combat forms that prioritized protection over destruction. They solved territorial disputes through negotiation, while maintaining the strength to enforce agreements when necessary. Most importantly, they proved that apex predators could maintain their edge while choosing compassion over cruelty. Prime Minister Ironmane watched his biological children work alongside alien siblings with increasing fascination. When Talon instinctively protected Sparkle from a simulated threat, when Fang collaborated with Buzz to solve a complex strategic problem, when Claw taught Whisper a defensive technique adapted for shadow manipulation, something fundamental shifted in the Prime Minister's worldview. This is not what we expected, he admitted finally. It's better than what you expected, Hawkins observed. These kids aren't just representing their species anymore. They're representing the future of interspecies cooperation. The negotiations that followed lasted 3 days and reshaped diplomatic protocols across 12 sectors. Prime Minister Ironmane didn't just agree to let the cubs remain with their human family. He formally requested that Mira establish a sister program on the Thrakari settlement worlds. We want our children to learn these innovations, he explained, but we want them to learn from Thrakari teachers who understand both traditions. 6 months later, the Goldstream Institute had campuses on 18 different worlds, each one adapted to local species requirements while maintaining the core principles of treating children as individuals deserving love, respect, and the freedom to choose their own paths. The cubs became traveling ambassadors, spending time between Earth and various alien worlds, demonstrating that identity wasn't limited by biology and that families could transcend any boundary the universe created. But perhaps the most significant change came from an unexpected source: the enforcement officers who had originally tried to remove the cubs. Officer Brava Stonemend, the team leader who had drawn her weapon during that first confrontation, requested transfer to the Institute's security division. I want to protect these families instead of destroying them, she explained during her interview. Her entire team followed her example, creating the first interspecies child protection force in galactic history. The bureaucrats who had crafted the original removal order found themselves reassigned to study groups analyzing the success of human integration techniques. Assistant Director Stormcrest became one of the most vocal advocates for expanding interspecies adoption programs. And me? I discovered that documenting revolutionary social change was infinitely more rewarding than filing bureaucratic paperwork. The cubs grew into remarkable adults who split their time between diplomatic missions and family gatherings. They never forgot the terror of nearly being separated from their human mother, but they channeled that memory into ensuring no other children would face similar threats. They established legal precedents that protected interspecies families. They created educational programs that taught both alien and human children about cultural cooperation. They proved that evolution didn't require abandoning compassion, that advancement didn't demand choosing strength over kindness. Most importantly, they demonstrated that humans possessed something the rest of the galaxy desperately needed: the ability to see potential instead of programming, individuals instead of categories, children instead of specimens. The day Talon graduated from the Institute's Advanced Diplomatic Program, he made a speech that summarized everything they had accomplished. "We learned that being strong means protecting those who need protection. Being smart means finding solutions that help everyone. Being brave means choosing love even when others choose fear." The Cubs had started as orphaned refugees facing forced separation from the only family they had ever known. They became ambassadors for a revolution in how the galaxy understood childhood, family, and the possibility of choosing to be better than genetic programming suggested. And it all began because one human woman looked at 3 frightened alien children and saw kids who needed a mother, not specimens who needed containment.